was a sweltering summer evening in the heart of Arizona. The desert heat hung heavy in the air, a dry blanket that clung to the skin, making the world feel like an oven. But the air felt alive with tension, a strange undercurrent that no one could quite put their finger on. Not even the hum of the desert cicadas could drown it out. For some, this evening would be like any other. For others, it would be the beginning of something they would never forget. Chapter 1. The Call. Sergeant Jake Hawk Wheeler had seen his fair share of chaos. A combat veteran who had served multiple tours in the Middle East, he was now a member of an elite emergency response unit, ERU, in Phoenix, Arizona. The unit was a collection of former military personnel, including medics, SWAT officers, and tactical operators, trained to respond to everything from hostage situations to natural disasters. Jake was the kind of guy you didn't mess with. His tall, muscular frame, shaved head, and quiet demeanor gave him an intimidating presence. He wasn't a man of many words, but when he spoke, people listened. He'd seen the worst of humanity in combat zones overseas and had dealt with his own share of trauma, but none of that had hardened him to the point of cruelty. He was still a man who believed in doing the right thing, no matter how difficult or dangerous it might be. That evening, Jake sat in the break room of the ERU office, sipping a cold coffee. His mind wandered, but only for a second, before the phone rang. The urgent tone in the dispatcher's voice snapped him to attention. "Wheeler, we need you and your team on a 1097, multiple casualties. Biker gang shootout at the intersection of 9th and Lincoln. They've blocked the roads and are threatening to escalate. Civilians caught in the crossfire." Jake's eyes narrowed. The last thing he wanted to deal with was a bunch of bikers acting like they owned the streets. But the job was the job. He grabbed his gear and nodded to his team. "We're rolling out," he said, his voice steady. Chapter 2. The Encounter. As the team sped toward the scene, Jake's mind flashed back to the kind of bikers he used to encounter back in his military days. Some were just weekend warriors, harmless and seeking adventure. Others were a different breed entirely. He wasn't sure which group he was going to find today, but he knew one thing. It wasn't going to be simple. When they arrived, the scene was a chaotic mess. The bikers, clad in leather and tattoos, had turned the intersection into a battlefield. Multiple motorcycles lay scattered on the ground, some still running, engines roaring in defiance. A couple of trucks with giant rebel flags were parked haphazardly across lanes, blocking any escape route. There were no signs of immediate gunfire, but that didn't mean it was over. Jake motioned for his team to deploy. He and his partner, Officer Daisy Blaze Hanley, took point, while the rest of the team moved to secure the perimeter. As they approached the wreckage, Jake could see the bikers weren't just fighting each other. They were actively holding civilians hostage. A woman, her face pale with fear, was backed up against one of the trucks, a burly biker towering over her with a gun in hand. Jake's blood began to boil. He had no tolerance for people who hurt the innocent. Without hesitation, he motioned to Blaze. "Cover me," he muttered, eyes locked on the biker. Blaze nodded, her eyes scanning for threats as Jake moved quickly, weaving between parked vehicles, closing the distance between himself and the biker. The man, distracted by his yelling at the woman, didn't see him coming until it was too late. Jake moved in like a shadow, tackling the man to the ground. The biker's gun went flying, and before he could recover, Jake had him pinned with his knee to the back, hands expertly cuffing him. "You're done, pal," Jake growled, his voice cold. But before Jake could stand up, another biker, much larger and angrier than the first, stormed forward. This was the kind of guy you didn't want to mess with a real brute. He had the look of a man who'd been in every fight, and he had the scars to prove it. "Hands off my brother, soldier." the big man roared, his voice deep and thunderous. Without warning, he lunged at Jake. It was a sweltering summer evening. Jake's training kicked in. He didn't hesitate. A swift sidestep, and the large biker barreled into a car, his momentum knocking him off balance. Jake immediately took advantage, delivering a powerful knee to the man's gut, followed by a sharp elbow to the side of his head. The thug crumpled to the ground, dazed. Jake stood over him, breathing heavily when the sound of approaching motorcycles grew louder. A gang of bikers, led by a man with a patch that read Reaper on the back, arrived at the scene. Reaper, a massive figure in his mid-40s, with long hair and a scar that ran down the left side of his face, looked like trouble. "Who the hell are you?" Reaper bellowed, eyeing Jake with disdain. Jake didn't flinch. "Emergency response unit. You're holding people hostage. Drop your weapons, or we'll take you down." Reaper's eyes narrowed. "You think you can just roll in here and tell us what to do, soldier?" His voice was dripping with mockery. "I'm not your average biker. I've been through more shit than you can imagine. You don't want to do this." Jake didn't respond. He'd heard this kind of bravado before, but he wasn't interested in the biker's empty threats. He could tell the man wasn't bluffing, though. Reaper had the look of someone who wasn't afraid to die, which made him dangerous. "You've already crossed a line," Jake said, voice steady. "This ends now." The standoff lasted for a tense moment, neither side moving. The heat of the Arizona desert pressed in, but it felt like the temperature was rising even higher. Then, Reaper did something unexpected. He nodded toward his men. "You heard the man," Reaper said. "Let's get out of here." Jake was taken aback. He'd expected a fight, maybe even a full-blown shootout. But instead, Reaper and his crew mounted their bikes and peeled out of the intersection, leaving Jake and his team to mop up the mess. Chapter 3: The Aftermath. As the bikers retreated, Jake and his team moved in to assess the situation. They had secured the civilians, most of whom were shaken but unharmed. The injured were quickly attended to, and Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. He'd done his job. The danger had passed for now. But something nagged at him. As Jake was talking to a witness, he saw Reaper's bike in the distance, still rolling toward the horizon. The biker hadn't just let them off the hook. There was something more to this, something Jake didn't understand. He'd been in enough dangerous situations to recognize when something wasn't right. Blaze approached him. "Is everything all right, Sergeant?" she asked, her tone cautious. Jake hesitated for a moment before answering. "I don't know. I've seen men like Reaper before." He didn't back down out of fear. He backed down out of respect. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." Chapter 4: The Confrontation. A few days later, Jake's instincts proved right. The gang came back. This time, they were more organized, more deliberate. They hit a warehouse where a shipment of medical supplies was being stored. Jake's team was called in to respond, and this time, it wasn't just a few bikers. It was a full-on assault. Jake and his team fought through the night, pushing back against the bikers who seemed to be everywhere. It was a brutal fight, but Jake wasn't backing down. The ERU team, trained for situations like this, pushed forward with precision, taking down the bikers one by one. Finally, it was just Jake and Reaper. They met face to face, each sizing the other up. "You should have walked away when you had the chance," Jake said. Reaper chuckled. "I walk away when I choose to, soldier. Not when some fancy SWAT boy tells me to." The fight was savage. But this time, Jake was prepared. With a final, decisive move, he disarmed Reaper and took him down to the ground. The rest of the gang saw their leader go down and knew the battle was lost. They surrendered. Epilogue: Respect earned. The bikers were arrested, and the threat was over. But Jake never forgot that final moment with Reaper. They were both soldiers, in different ways, but both men understood the same code: respect. It was a bond that, even in the heat of battle, transcended everything else. As Jake walked away from the scene, he couldn't help but feel a small sense of respect for Reaper. He'd been the wrong guy to mess with, but he wasn't a coward. And for that, Jake gave him credit. In the world of chaos, sometimes it was the toughest who earned the greatest respect.